Hello, everyone. I'm Eric Lorber. I'm the director of Rain Taxi, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our 20th Twin Cities Book Festival. It snowed here this morning in Minnesota, and we're occasionally having a little snow online as well. But we thank you for rolling with the punches and being patient as we conduct our first virtual book festival. We hope that as you poke around our website, you'll enjoy all the elements, including this author event, U.S. History Gets Graphic. Something you should know about our magazine, Rain Taxi Review of Books, is that we, from the start, have reviewed graphic novels as literature. It was a rare thing to do 25 years ago. I'm very happy it's so much more common now. Of course, the term graphic novel isn't exactly flawless. Many comics artists create works of graphic nonfiction, as is the case in our panel today. We have with us three great authors. Derf Backderf is coming to us from Cleveland, Ohio. He's the best-selling author of books like My Friend Dahmer, which was the basis for a feature film, and Trashed, which won an Eisner Award. Derf has also received the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award for his political cartoons, and his newest graphic novel is Kent State, Four Dead in Ohio. Our Sikoryak is joining us from New York. I first began following his work when I'd spot his whimsical adaptations of the classics in places like Raw magazine. He's taken that penchant for adaptation to create such innovative books as Terms and Conditions and The Unquotable Trump, and the brand new Constitution Illustrated. And James Otis Smith is a multi-talented artist in many different media, from illustration to video work. He has illustrated books previously, such as Showtime at the Apollo, the epic tale of Harlem's legendary theater, and his new book, Black Heroes of the Wild West, is actually his first as both author and illustrator. Moderating our session today is Kim Todd. She's on the creative writing faculty at the University of Minnesota here. Kim is the author of 3 nonfiction books herself, with a 4th coming next year. And I'm delighted she could lead us through this discussion of nonfiction comic art. I want to remind all our viewers that you can ask questions using the field below. You can buy books hitting that link. You can donate to Rain Taxi if you'd like. We're nonprofit, and every dollar we raise during this festival will get us started on planning whatever we're going to do in 2021. Thanks again for joining us, and take it away, Kim.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here with you three to discuss these astonishing books. So we'll talk a little bit, and then we'll have a Q&A with the audience. Though audience, feel free to toss questions in as we go also, if they occur to you. So I will just get started. So my first question is, all 3 of these works cover history. The Constitution Illustrated by our Sikoryak, focusing on the text of the Constitution of the United States. Black Heroes of the West by James Otis Smith, highlighting figures from the 19th century. And Kent State, Four Dead in Ohio by Derf Backderf, detailing events in May 1970. At the same time as they're excavating the past, they all seem very engaged with the present moment. And I was wondering your thoughts about telling these particular stories now.
Well, I'll go first. The first thing that occurred to me as you asked that question was the history never went away. So I think it's kind of always, everything that we're covering is always relevant, but it rises and falls depending on what's going on. But it's kind of never been out of date, really. I mean, there's never a bad time to talk about the Constitution, unless you're on a date. But, yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah, no, I absolutely concur. I mean, I always felt that my story was pretty relevant as I was working on it. I didn't think it would become this relevant, but there's nothing wrong with. I mean, I think a big flaw in our country is that we don't know our history that well. So anyone who wants to tell good history gets a salute from me.
I just wanted to follow up on what James was saying about you didn't use this term, but sort of the cyclical nature of history. I certainly felt when I decided to make this book, I certainly was aware that it felt very pertinent at the moment. But I always remind people that 10 years ago, 5 years ago, when Obama was president, people were saying, he's not paying attention to the Constitution. So there's this constant, half of the country is always saying, whoever the president is, they should read the Constitution. So it seemed like the right time again.
So it must be like a challenge to balance all these considerations, often in a single image on a page. And so we're going to put a PowerPoint on the screen, and I wonder if each of you could talk about the creation of a particular panel or the creation of a particular number of panels that took a while to get right, maybe that went through several revisions as the book progressed. And the PowerPoint goes in chronological order, so the first images are from the Constitution.
Yes. Hi. So here's a couple of pages from my book, which is the entire text of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the amendments. Each page is in the style of a different American comics artist or comics character. So I really made an effort to include as broad a spectrum of American comics as I could. As the Constitution is a living document, I wanted to make sure that even though this was written in the past and the characters are often drawn in the period in which the Constitution or the amendments were written, the characters range from contemporary to historical. So this page that's up right now is an excellent example of the range I was trying to get in terms of the gender, race, and age of the characters and the creators. Here we have, on the left, we have the Yellow Kid, which is thought of as being the first American newspaper comic that really kind of codified comic strips. And then on the right, we have an homage to Dogman, which is one of the most popular comics for kids. So I wanted someone who picked up this book to find some character in it that they might remember from their childhood or remember from reading last week, and sort of remind them that the Constitution is constantly speaking to us in the moment as it speaks to the past.
That's amazing. So this is the opening sequence from Black Heroes of the Wild West. And this one was tricky. This one was tricky because it's an event from the life of Mary Fields where she was attacked by wolves. And it's a kid's book, and you want to tell the truth, but you also don't want your protagonist to be killing animals on the first page. So so there was a lot of thinking about like getting creative with the lighting and the sequencing. And I guess in terms of what was difficult about it, I have this problem where, well, it's not really a problem, but trying to speak to kids, and obviously you don't want to talk down to them, but you also don't want to start to pull in visual language that they may not be familiar with at the same time. So there was a lot of revisions in terms of just trying to get something that interested me on the page in terms of the layout without forgetting who my main readers are, you know? And also just drawing lots of animals, which is not really my forte, but I'm getting better at it. Yes. So what actually happened in this event was Mary was delivering the mail, and it overturned in the mountains. And then she was, if you believe the legends, she was attacked by wolves and had to fight them off until someone came along to help. And I just like the idea of beginning the book, even though it's not really like an action comic. I like the idea of beginning it with an action sequence that doesn't have a lot of dialogue in it, and then going into the biography. Yeah.
Oh, that's me. So yeah, I had, I'm depicting a recent event. I mean, compared to James and Bob. So there are some images that exist. Obviously, Kent State. This is the iconic one, which is this young protester, Marianne Vecchio, screaming over the body of Jeff Miller in the parking lot, and it's one of the great news photos of the 20th century. And it's a pivotal moment. It's kind of the climax of the book. But my problem is how to depict this in comics form. So I really struggled with it because I didn't just want to, recreate the image, because I think that looks really staged and lame when people do that in other media. Like I've seen some movies or TV documentaries that do that, and I think, So this is the thumbnail. So this is how I write, and I was, fooling around with things, and actually the thumbnail, I wasn't happy with it, so I really kind of worked it out on the pencil page. If you go to the next one here, yeah. And what I decided to do was to not focus on the figure, but to focus on the one thing that comics can do that the photograph couldn't do, and that's the visual representation of that sound effect, which is uniquely comics, right? So you have this wail of a scream that sort of carries over the page. And actually, if you'll advance to the next one, oh, that's the finish. So advance to the last one there. There we go. It actually carries over 3 pages. So it starts in the previous page, and then you flip the page, and you get this wail just going right over the entire spread. And that's how I decided to tackle it. I think it's a little different, but I think it's fairly effective. But these are the challenges that you face when you try to recreate real events.
Thank you. That's fascinating, hearing about the process. Bob, I just wanted to say one thing about the Constitution book, which was like not a project that I was like, what is he thinking about doing it this way? But it was really interesting the way that having all the different characters voice the different sections made you realize that it was a conversation, that the Constitution sort of arose from one person saying, we need to include this, and then the other person coming in and saying, but also don't forget about this. And I thought that was really a wonderful aspect of your book.
That's great. Thank you.
My next question is, so on the opening pages of the Kent State book, before you even get to the main text, it announces this book is a dramatic recreation, but all of it is based on eyewitness accounts, detailed research, and investigation. And each of the books in some ways foregrounds some of these documents, from the photos in Black Heroes to the charting of the precise bullet trajectories in Kent State. And I wonder if each of you would discuss the play in your work between source material and a fidelity to facts and creativity.
I'll let one.
Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, I got one. It's hard on Zoom sometimes to know when to jump in, but that is something that I always like to play with in my work. I think that the Constitution illustrated book is a little different than some of my other books, because in this one I was really trying to make sure that it would function as kind of an educational book. Sometimes my work likes to play with fidelity to source material and fidelity to the comic strips that I am parodying, in a way that they sometimes go against each other. But in this case, I was really wanting to make sure that even though you'd get a little whiplash going from one style to the next, from page to page, that there would still be a certain verisimilitude in the costuming of the characters, in the locations of the characters. I did a lot of research in terms of getting the buildings correct and the chairs correct and whatnot, but also making sure that there was also a lot of fidelity to the artists I was parodying. I really wanted people familiar with the comics to feel that familiarity, but I also wanted people who might not have even notice those details to really be able to sort of appreciate the time and the place that the words were written. So there was a lot of research in terms of visual research, and also just reading the texts that were relevant.
Yeah, one of the reasons we have so much historical information in the beginning and the end of the book is because so much of what we know about these people is kind of legend. We obviously looked for multiple sources to back up as much as we could, but these are people whose lives weren't really recorded to begin with, and that's kind of the point of the book. So the way that we supplemented that was just by putting more historical information and the bibliography, so that you could at least get more of a accurate context of the time, even if because there's so many legends about these characters, like we don't necessarily know everything that's true about them. So I wanted to be true about the time, even if I couldn't be precise about the people.
I'm up. I mean, you know, I tried to be as accurate as I possibly could. I mean, to really a ridiculously anal retentive degree. There's 28 pages of footnotes in the back. I mean, everything is sourced almost panel to panel. And obviously, I'm making up conversations, but even the conversations, the method I use is that I base it on something that's sourced and kind of work that source material into the conversation. For example, when say one of Jeff Miller is talking about, you know, changing majors. Well, that's based on documentation that I have and an account that I have, and I just worked it into a conversation, which obviously I'm making up. So that's just how I kind of approached it. But I think if you're upfront about it, which I was, because you read my introduction, that it's a dramatic recreation, I mean, that kind of lets you off the hook.
Yeah, the photographs in Black Heroes really, I think, added this whole other dimension to it, because you realize, like, oh, this isn't, you know, something that someone is making up. Here are actual people in this actual time, in this actual place.
Right.
And it was really wonderful. Derf, did you think about including more photos in your work or actual documents? Or
no, I
was that
didn't.
not something you wanted?
No, because those photos have been pretty, you know, they're pretty famous. There's many that were taken on that day. So there's also, you know, certain copyright problems involved with using other people's work. So no, I didn't. I never considered that. I wanted it specifically to be a world that I kind of, you know, created within the covers of that book, and not have any other media intrude in that.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll start taking the questions that the audience is asking. So if you've been holding on to your question, just toss it into that ask a question spot at the bottom, and I will ask it. All of you have written other books, and in some cases, many, many other books. And I wonder what was the new discovery of this project? What made it an exciting challenge for you?
Well, I have to admit, never read the Constitution in any kind of depth before I started this. So really going through it and pulling apart all of the pieces that I wanted to illustrate, kind of recognizing all of the, I mean, we were aware of the compromises that were made, but sort of seeing how soon the compromises show up in the document that, you know, we still haven't resolved. So there was like a deep dive into that, and there was also, because it's unabridged, so I had to deal with all of it. I didn't take out a word or a period. And the other thing that really was different for me for this book was I wanted to make sure that I represented cartoonists who I hadn't parodied before. And my whole career was built around parody, but there's a lot of artists from history and younger artists, newer artists that I had never tried to emulate before, and it was a learning experience for me to go through all of history, see what was on the bestseller list, see what historians of comics had written about, and try to like bring all of these voices together into one book. So the scope of it, I think, was broader and maybe deeper than anything I've tried before.
I guess in terms of learning something new, that's essentially what you were asking, right? I guess, so one of the reasons that I like to do nonfiction is because it's an excuse for me to learn as I'm working. And something that's like the way we're taught American history, or the way we engage with it in the media in some way, it's usually everything is kind of in a silo. So for instance, even though I grew up loving cowboys and the Wild West and that kind of thing, it never clicked in my head like, oh, this is the Reconstruction, right? And like, what kind of country outside of the desert, which is all you see in the movies, like what's happening in America? And I learned that in another context, but didn't really think of them as being happening at the same time. So I guess what I'm saying is that it helped make my understanding of American history like more holistic, right, where everything is connected, which I think is a lack in the way that we learn history, where chapter 2 is the Civil War or whatever, and you don't really think about like what else is happening in the country at that time, what else is happening in the world at that time. So, and if it were a longer book, I would have liked to have maybe added more of what was going on in the world at the same time,
Yeah, my book had just kind of a long list of challenges. It's not something I've done before. The sheer size of it's like 280 pages, which is pretty dense, and it's daunting. And there's a period piece. It's not my period. I was not part of that generation, so it's kind of going back in time and trying to figure things out and put yourself in that position. And then just the drawing challenges, this big campus, you got crowd scenes, you've got night scenes, military scenes, night crowd scenes, night crowd military scenes. It honestly kicked my ass repeatedly in the entire 2 years that I spent drawing it. So, but you know how it is. If you make the commitment to doing it, you just kind of throw yourself into it and do the best you can, and somehow it seems to work out. You can't. There's no fear in comics. You just got to forge ahead.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to go to some of these questions now. So the first one is, wait a minute, where did the first one go? I love how graphic history might connect reluctant readers to important context for current events and how we got here. I'm curious, how do our authors, speakers pick the topics they choose to present in this way?
How did we pick the topics? Was that the question?
I think so, yep.
I think it's just, in my case anyway, it was just something that I loved and have always wanted to do. Usually the way that I'll come up with an idea is I look at what everyone else is doing and figure who's not being talked about in that context. So, like, I love cowboy movies. Who's not being talked about in cowboy movies? I'll bet there's something interesting about them. And then you just read as much as you can, and someone has an interesting life, and then you just try to pull that out.
For me, it made total sense to do the Constitution, partially, as I say, because people are always talking around it or about it. And also, a lot of my books previously dealt with historical texts. I would adapt classic literature like Wuthering Heights or the Iliad. So going back in time while also sort of speaking to the moment was appealing to me, and I felt like the Constitution could do both.
Oh, excuse me. For me, I've always been fascinated with the story of Kent State. I mean, it's something I got interested in when I was a teenager, and I've carried it with me ever since. So it was always on a list of books I wanted to get to. I just didn't feel confident enough in my abilities to take it on before now. I had to get a few books under my belt. And, you know, it's different for me. I like doing different things. So, you know, I thought it would be a challenge. It was, and that's why I took it on.
And then I write that the I at the beginning of the book is you sort of encountering these events when you're younger, or is that not correct?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in the opening scene. Yeah, when I was a little kid. Yeah.
And then this is a follow-up question about the Constitution book. I believe that Mr. Sikoryak mentioned that he used the actual text of the Constitution word for word. What influenced your decision to do that rather than use or create a more explanatory text that would help people understand the language of the Constitution?
Well, I knew that the illustrations were going to be interpreting it. So I feel like the illustrations do my job, which is to show parts of the meaning and maybe in some ways give my perspective on things, even though it's filtered through the perspectives of the other artists. But there's so much argument about what the Constitution says that it only seemed appropriate to not change the words. I looked at a lot of books that translated it into language for kids, and sometimes you'll see reviewers saying, "Oh, well, that's not what it actually says. You know, this is a misinterpretation." So everyone kind of gets very protective about the original words. And also, I'm someone that previously has adapted the entirety of the iTunes terms and conditions into a graphic novel. So I like taking dense texts that people should read but don't necessarily read and sort of lay them out there with images that hopefully will draw people in. So while the Constitution text remains dense and somewhat archaic in ways, it is decipherable. And I think the visuals go a long way toward getting you there. So that was the hope.
I feel like there was a time when I was a newspaper reporter covering city council meetings when people were always whipping out their pocket Constitution and telling me, like, citing different parts of it. So I would be much more happy to receive this particular version.
Well, that is why I made it pocket-sized, so people could wave it around.
There you go. I hope it's well adopted among those folks. So another question is, can you, any or all, talk about your writing process? Do you write with straight text like a comic book writer, or use lots of thumbnails to help your thinking and writing process? Can you talk about creating an outline, how to frame a sprawling historical occurrence?
Wow. I always write in thumbnails. So, you know, I'll fill notebooks with sketchbooks with just little, oh, look, James has a show off. He's came prepared. And so, you know, I'll make notes and scroll. I mean, it's indecipherable to anybody but me. And then I go directly to a very detailed pencil, and that's usually where I work out all the kinks. And, you know, it's a slow process. Yeah, you do outlines, you do all those things. It varies from book to book, but, you know, you do what you have to do to make sense of it.
Yeah, I change depending on my moods, but I usually start with notes, and then the thumbnails look like that, essentially,
Wow.
which is pretty indecipherable. And then I'll scan that. If I have the text at that point, I'll scan those in and I'll put the text on it, and then I'll know, okay, I need some more room in a certain panel or whatever. I usually work digitally, but on this book, I actually drew on paper for the first. I think I've been drawing digitally for about 12 years. So this was the first book I drew on paper in like over a decade. So I was pretty excited about that. I just like to get ink on my hands. And I think
Me too.
yeah. And given the amount of computer problems I've had in the last week, I think I'm probably just going to go back to paper. So there's a lot. In this case, because I was working with an editor, there was a lot of back and forth with the thumbnails, and we would even cut the thumbnails up and rearrange them. And then the actual like writing that goes on the page, that changes as much as it can until I have to I have to sign off on it.
Right.
Even though I didn't write the Constitution, I do sort of take the formatting of comics really
You can take credit
seriously.
for it, Bob. Go ahead.
I'd rather not. There's some problematic things in it. Anyway, there's some good stuff in it too. Anyway, I even when I work with a text like this that I haven't written, I tend to lay it out. I use a program called Indesign, which is used for designers and laying out type, like for books or magazines. And basically, I copied and pasted the entire text into a document and then broke it down about a sentence or two per page. So I had 110 pages ultimately. And then from there, I would do like these very rough drawings with here's the text before I've even used my lettering font. And then I would just do a very quick scribble. And from here, I just made a binder full of these pages in order with my sketches in it. And then as I revise them, this is the final drawing before it's colored. It's totally changed in terms of the conception, but it's the same text. And so I go through drafts that way. And as I go from the first sketch to the final, I'm like looking for what artists I might use, but having the whole document laid out that way. And sometimes I'll print out multiple pages like I did here to sort of see what they look like. And then from there, start choosing what artist to use. So it's almost like building a crossword puzzle, because I do kind of think of like the totality of the project, even as I'm honing in and drawing individual pages.
Here, I have to show one of my thumbnails since everybody else did. Mine are a lot sloppier, but James's were really small. I mean, that's amazing.
It's the only way that I can keep a handle on the
narrative
perspective and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Because when you do a narrative, you have to think about how the two pages go together. Then you have to think about the whole scene. Then you have to think about the whole overarching narrative of the. I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
It sounds a lot more complicated than it is. I mean, I just fly by the seat of my pants. It's just kind of all instinctual, but. You do have to think about these things, so it's a very different process, I think, than people who just do the written word. I mean, it's a completely different. It's probably much more akin to film and making storyboards. That's really how you get to think about it.
Well, I'm going to ask another question, and I'm going to invite audience people to ask more questions. And then I might ask you guys if you have any questions for each other, since you all seem very knowledgeable.
Oh, you're already out of stuff to say. That's
no,
a
I'm
cheap
not.
trick.
I'm just saying that you might have a lot to say to each other. But I guess, so one of my questions is the reverse of the question that I asked before, and we don't have the slides for this one, but going into the project, was there one image or one panel that you knew that you really wanted to make? Like you knew, like, oh, the Art Spiegelman page is going to go with this Constitution text. So just something you were sure of going in that was maybe like the seed of it for you, of how you wanted it to be.
Well, I grew up reading Peanuts, so I knew very early on that the First Amendment about freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, I knew this could be illustrated with the characters from Peanuts. Linus was forever praying, a lot of the characters were carrying protest signs in the 60s, and Lucy is always stating her opinion, whether people want to hear it or not. So this image was one of the first ones I drew. It's in the middle of the book, but Peanuts was always my go-to. And, you know, I was very happy. Once I saw this, once I drew this one out, I was like, okay, I can make this book.
Are you guys familiar with Blood Meridian, the novel? So
Yeah.
I've never
it's
read
a McCarthy book, and it's kind of like there's long stretches of a guy walking through, or sometimes riding a horse in the desert, and then there's a couple pages where people get killed, and then there's 20, 30 pages of walking through the desert again. And I kind of wanted, I wanted someone in the desert, and I wanted to be able to convey the amount of color and life that there is in the desert, even though it seems dead. The desert is really beautiful. So just this idea of a single person alone in this very colorful but desolate environment, which is one of my favorite things about the Western. So I knew that somehow I wanted that in there. Yeah, so that's it. I probably would love to do, I told somebody once that my dream project would be just a 600-page book of a guy walking through the desert. So this is like the first 2 or 3 pages of that.
Okay, this is mine. So this page here, I was actually down in Kent doing some research, and I was just walking. This scene is still there, but I was just walking along this stretch up here by the, on the rail, when this scene came to me of the helicopter flying down the river channel with the spotlight, and I thought, oh man, that'd be really cool to draw. And so that one was one I really wanted to get in there, and I was really happy with the way it came out. But that's the benefit of being able to put yourself in the actual scene, and just see what comes to you for inspiration. Now, obviously, we can't do that with every book, but in this case, I could do it. And that, there are a couple scenes in the book where that's exactly what happened. So, but that was the best one that turned out best.
Looks awesome, man.
Well, thanks. It'll pale beside your 600 page Walking in the Desert book, though, and that's going to be visually amazing.
This is perhaps more of a question for Derf than the other of you, but feel free to jump in if it's relevant. I know a lot of nonfiction writers are concerned about how their work will be received by people involved or people implicated, and I was wondering if you got pushback on your book from anyone who's still alive around the events, or if you were just concerned about that as you were writing.
I wasn't terribly concerned about it. I mean, there are a lot of people that have a lot of ownership over the story for obvious reasons. I mean, they felt bullets whiz over their heads, or saw their friend laying dead nearby. The overall reaction, I've heard from a lot of people who were there and a lot of people who were involved, and the overall reaction has been very positive. So that makes me think I got most of it right. There's always people that are going to disagree. I mean, it's a very divisive issue. It certainly was in 1970, as you can imagine. I mean, it's very akin to what's happening now with, the anti-war movement in 1970 is the partisan sniping is, or more than sniping. Gosh, that's a bad word to use in talking about Kent State too. The partisan battles are much the same as we have right now with the BLM stuff. And it's just, this chasm. And so to see that repeated, I thought there'd be more coming from, the other side, the right, who still are pissed about, what happened in 1970. But there really hasn't been. I was kind of surprised by that. So maybe they've moved on. I don't know. But no, it's been overall, it's been very positive.
So we have 2 more questions from the audience, and then I think we'll probably be at about time. One is, can you talk a little bit about how you navigate acknowledging young people's intelligence while still being aware of their bandwidth? So I guess writing for young people and.
Yeah, so in my case, I had an editor who would just tell me, like, you can't use that word. And then, that actually is something I'm still working on, because I generally just make the assumption that a young person is someone who just hasn't read the same books as me. And then, if they can't, if the pictures are interesting enough, I think they'll want to catch up. I actually think publishers, and I understand from their position why, but I think publishers are maybe a little more hesitant than they need to be about the capability of young readers.
For me, I just wanted to make sure that I treated all the artists I parodied with due respect. And I wanted to make sure, like I said, if you were a fan of Dogman, you'd be like, oh, that looks like Dogman. Or if you're looking at my Raina Telgemeier page, you're like, oh, okay, I recognize her characters. So I wanted to just make sure that everybody had, everyone was represented fairly. I liked what James said about, the question about whether we need to be more simple or we need to shy away from things for kids. I'm not really sure about that. I didn't specifically make my book for a younger audience, but librarians have said that they think it will be appealing to kids, and I certainly hope so. But maybe luckily I didn't worry about that so much as just sort of being as reverent as I could with the materials I chose to work with.
I never really write for kids. I mean, I write for me more than anything. I know that sounds selfish, but if I'm interested in it, I hope somebody else will be. But I never write down to kids, and all my books have wound up on YALSA lists. So I guess, I mean, the kids are pretty smart. I mean, and I think they're pretty curious, and so I've had really good response from younger readers. But I never write something specifically for them. I think the big, my publisher doesn't really make me take out swear words or anything, but I think the big you can't cross this line thing is sex scenes. If you've got sex scenes in your book, that's it. Yeah, it's not for YA. But if you don't have those, then it's everything's game.
Great, thanks. So the last question, I think this is specifically for James, is, and I just thought that was a really interesting point that you made after you talked about the different silos, then you're kind of taking down the natural history silo also. But this person wanted to know, did you research desert plants and animals?
Well, there's no animals except for the horses, which I researched a lot. There's no desert animals in it, but there's going to be more books. So, and the subsequent ones may have less characters, so there'll be more time. So there's not really a lot of that in there, but maybe in the next ones.
And there is one more question about how your career started, but I want to sort of ask Eric, if you're out there. I think we're at time. Is that right? Eric? I'm not hearing anything.
No, he's gone. He's fallen asleep. He's drifted off.
He's fallen asleep. Okay. Well,
I think we're pretty close, but
yeah.
if you
pretty close on time.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you guys can give the super short answer to this question, which I do not think takes super short.
How did your career start?
How did your career start?
I can give you a short answer. I was a video editor and realized I didn't like working on other people's movies anymore. And so I remembered that I still knew how to draw. So I became a storyboard artist. And then someone asked me to draw a comic book. That's it.
Nice.
Okay.
I started drawing comics as a kid with my brothers, and I think that's where my career started. You know, I didn't get paid till after I got out of school. I went to art school, and I was very lucky to work with Art Spiegelman and Francoise Mouly when they were working on Raw Magazine, which was an amazing opportunity. But I mean, the main way my career started was that I just put in the hours from when I was a kid. I always wanted to draw comics.
Yeah, me too. I started when I was like 5 years old, and then first got published in college for the school paper, and that was it.
Okay, and Rain Taxi says we are out of time.
There you go.
But thank you all so much. I loved reading the books and loved hearing you talk about them.
Awesome. Had a great time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you. It was great.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.